All right, everyone, welcome to the weekly API work group meeting. We got several things to cover today. I've got a list of the topics I'll share briefly here. If I get pulled out, there we go. So basically, and I think this came out of the OPI provisioning meeting. Boris, you brought up the question on defining a unique identifier for the network interface with respect to how Kubernetes and how it's going to advertise it up to the different CNIs. That was the question you wanted to ask in the meeting?
Yeah, but we can start with the quality of service and then circle back to this.
Yep. No, I just wanted to raise the question so people can start thinking about it. And then,
yes, basically in the provisioning lifecycle group, we started to brainstorm on ideas how to uniquely identify the network interface, the virtual physical functions between the host and inside the device. I think that in this group, it was kind of an assumption that it just works. So we brainstorm a little bit on this and we can discuss it today, what the outcomes are and whether it's good enough or not good enough for this group as a solution.
Yep, thank you. So the next thing, and this is what we wanted to get into, we wanted to talk about the storage QoS. There's a series of questions here related to that, but in terms of covering the storage QoS related topics, I think we have Artek. I think you're on the call because you've raised a PR. If you wanted to go ahead and bring that up and discuss that.
Yes, so today I have created a PR regarding QoS and I'd like to discuss it with all of you. So probably I'll share the screen.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, so in this PR, we have been trying to address QoS on two levels, on volume level and on device level, right? And volume level, it looks very similar to what we've got for other services with create, delete, etc. calls, right? And it creates a wrapping object for other volumes, like for encryption, where we need to provide, a limit on min level and max level, right? And those limits, they include IOPS and bandwidth limits on read, write, and mixed read, write. Pretty simple, right? Device level, it looks a bit different from what we have for volume. Because we provide limits directly in controller device structures. It can add some benefits, like there might be IPUs, DPUs which do not support controller creation and encryption setting, right? And also middle end, it's rather concentrated on work with volumes, right? But this approach is a bit different from what OPI states, like creating of wrapping objects, right? And it is different from OPI stated that we need to have QoS in middle end, but this approach, propagate QoS to other levels like front end and potentially back end. And I'd like to find out what do you think about that approach?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, KOS.
In your proposal, where do you manage the tokens and where do you queue up and where do you enforce QoS? Is it close to the device or is it up in the stack? Because
QoS limit can be applied, those settings can be applied on volume level by means of this service, right? So we can create like, we can attach to a remote NVMe controller, which exposes some namespaces, right? And we can apply, those QoS on a specific volume exposed by that device, right? But if you talk about device, it means that we apply those QoS on all namespaces, all devices attached to that controller. Like in NVMe, you can have multiple namespaces, and we apply those limits to all namespaces in this controller. So if you run the traffic through, for example, 3 namespaces, and we have max limit, for example, the overall traffic cannot be greater than, for example, 10 gigabytes per second, right?
So this is not a QoS limit on a particular pod or a particular set of processes that can be driving this. This is on a per namespace basis you're going to enforce, limitations in terms of throughput and bandwidth.
It's in 2 places. So it's giving you the option to do it either per NVMe namespace, which is called a volume here,
Okay.
or per like virtual function, or physical function exposed to the host, because the devices can do both and they have different use cases.
Okay.
And you can combine the two too. This is not saying you have to do one or the other. It's you can do both at the same time or ignore one, any combination.
Okay. So this is a scheme where the hardware is expected to provide the level of QoS control that we want to surface through some APIs here. Yeah.
It's not assuming there's any particular implementation.
Okay.
Here, I think many of us assume that certainly the front-end version is done by hardware.
Okay.
Any other questions?
What if the quality of service conflict between different levels? If you set improper or conflicting limits on backend, front end, and middle end?
It's rather conflict between, stated approach that, QoS should be middle end, but we just need to make a decision that we are okay that for device level we can have QoS settings in the devices in front end and back end. So
I understand, but the question is, what happens if you have the quality of service on the front and back end, which conflicting?
I see. That's a good question.
I would expect them to be completely independent of one another. And so if you set a really low limit on the front end and then a higher limit on the middle end, you're going to get the front end limit. And I wouldn't expect the two to necessarily like look at each other's settings to try to work that out. It's going to do exactly what you tell it to.
Makes sense. Just need documentation. Yeah.
I mean, an implementation could. The API here doesn't care if you can fail any of these calls, right? Like, or tell people they're invalid parameters. An API could warn users, hey, your front end limit is 10,000 IOPS, and you just tried to set a back end limit of 1 million IOPS. It's not going to do anything. It could. But I don't think in the API that there's any expectation that the system must, try to warn you.
And on the front end, because we have both subsystem controller and namespace over PCI Express, I was always thinking that quality of service belongs to the controller. Is that what you're showing here?
Yeah, here it is part of NVMe controller spec.
And the reason is because it's tightly coupled to virtual and physical functions, right?
Yes.
So basically the flow control, the quality of service is on the PFs and VFs.
Yep.
Yeah, and I fully expect people will have like front end, people's hardware is not going to match the same boundaries between front, middle, and back end as we have in OPI, and that's okay. So I fully expect there's some people whose front end hardware, like what they call their front end, does volume level QoS, right? And all they need to do is just take the middle end QoS call and apply it to their front end hardware, right? There's some mapping between those things, but there's no reason in the OPI APIs for us to have a front end namespace level quality of service, because you have the middle end, which is the same thing.
Yeah, the question that I have, Ben, is maybe the middle end becomes redundant at all.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, well, it's not redundant as it's coded here, but if you were to do namespace level in the front end, it would be. But in general, we would like to do all of the, processing and all of the stages of the pipeline and logic as middle end, as much as possible, because it allows for extra flexibility. There's things you can do by layering, volumes in the middle end that you can't do if it's all in the front end. For instance, say you are building a middle end volume that's composed of two other volumes, one of which is a cache device and one of which is a large, slower storage device, and you wanted to apply QoS to a portion of that cache device, right? You can do that by applying, like layering it in the middle end, but you can't do that if it's in the front end, right? So keeping things in the middle end is more powerful. It's like a more expressive system. So we would prefer as much configuration goes there as possible.
And if it's in the middle end, you also can stack, right? You can do like encryption, then quality of service, and compression, then, stupid thing, but another quality of service on top of it.
Yeah, you can.
Vipin, from your proposal on the, what you have, any comments, questions, concerns?
Definitely, we need something like this. I think it's a good start. What I need to confirm is whether controller is the right granularity or the namespace or something else. But I mean, you alluded that it could be at a VF level. The problem with introducing it at different levels is that now you have to handle the mix of those things. We don't want to make it complicated. So picking the right granularity from get-go and just using that as the fundamental base would be quite useful. So I could comment on the PR on that one, but overall, I think the idea seems good to have these kinds of QoS guarantees, because likely most of these block volumes will be allocated to different tenants, and you would want that. There is potentially one more level of isolation, or rather, QoS guarantees we need, which is between storage and network traffic, but that's a little bit out there. We definitely don't want to squeeze network traffic with storage traffic and have minimum guarantees for storage traffic, at least on that sense. So anyway, that's how I feel about it. I don't know, Ben, would you say that, namespace is the right construct for the controller?
Well, we've chosen both namespace and controller because I do actually believe you need both to express everything that users would want to do.
And if user has specified both, then how do you marry the two? You have to honor both as, at their minimum and maximum limits.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a bad config,
That's
it's the
what I'm
minimums that are the problem, right? The minimums are the hard part. Like
correct.
maximum is easy to
Yeah.
layer because
Yeah.
you just apply the lowest one.
Correct.
The minimums are hard, but you're going to get the lowest minimum.
Or
Yeah,
as
I
Ben
think-
said, if you can check and just return the wrong invalid argument reply that
Yeah.
this is not a valid configuration, it's up to you. If you're able to validate and check the validity.
So another way to look at this is there is some cost that is going to be set by the system administrator, the host, if you will, that's spinning up these VMs in terms of how that control plane is going to divvy up the available bandwidth and and all the cost metrics across the various VMs that are going to be launched. And then within the VM itself, maybe we might have multiple pods running, and there's another level of divvying up of the available resources from a Kubernetes control plane perspective. Is that a good way to think about this problem? A hierarchical way of kind of managing your resources?
I mean, that's certainly what I hear from people who want to use systems like this.
Yeah.
They say your VM can get 1 million total IOPS, but you have 3 disks, and one disk can do up to 1 million IOPS, and the other 2 can do up to 50,000 each. But total, you can only do 1 million, right? So you have to have that 2-layer,
Right.
like that. It has to work this way.
So the APIs you would have obviously would then be partitioned into those that can be invoked by the control plane on the host/DPU as it divvies up at a course level what needs to be presented to these various VMs, and then there is another set of APIs available inside the VM to further constrain what's been given.
Well, I don't think any of this is configurable from inside the VM.
Oh, no? Okay.
No. This is tenant configuration, or rather, this is cloud provider configuration to enforce tenants.
So this is all at a VM level is what we're seeing here. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
but still, you could do
The
it.
rules
VM
are at a
level.
VM level, right?
Okay.
The enforcement's at a VM level,
Correct.
can be.
Yeah, but the management is coming from the control plane.
Correct.
Yeah, the decisions are based on like what you paid for.
Yep.
Right. That's based on what you clicked in the web UI for how much you're willing to pay for. They're provisioning the disks for you.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the use case I see. The hierarchy point of view, a bigger ask that I see on the hierarchy really is at a tenant level. Like, there needs to be a little bit more. Let's say you have n number of VMs or n number of disks accessed by a given tenant. You want to limit a tenant to using X number of resources ultimately. So I don't know whether like disks, which is really the volumes here, and then controller versus tenant would be the right thing, because you do need to consolidate and aggregate. Like a given tenant cannot exceed XYZ total, regardless of how much has been committed to this, because ultimate payment entity is a tenant and not really a disk owner.
I mean, it's an interesting thought. Most of the cloud providers are electing to not show a tenant more than one controller, more than one VF. Right. So controller and tenant become the same.
Well,
Like,
I'm not sure.
You could imagine a system that's different than that.
Right. Most cloud providers, kind of bury the QoS guarantees as part of the VM SKU itself, right? If a tenant picks up a particular VM SKU, they're guaranteed, a certain level of network bandwidth and disk IOPS and so on. So if a tenant wants to spin up multiple VMs, they can pick a correct mix of these VM SKUs that would match their needs in terms of resources. So once you pick a VM SKU and launch that VM, the max that VM can get is already kind of spoken for, right? You can't go past. At least that's the way it's in our cloud.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting question is, what do we do if some cloud designs itself around a system where they're going to expose more than one VF to a single VM, right? And then they want, the XPU here to do tenant level quality of service enforcement, right? That's not been my experience in what the cloud providers are asking.
Because what you're saying, just understand, Ben, the problem is with this statement because they will get like two devices and the
Two
quality of
controllers,
service will be applied on each and every one separately and not a combined one.
Yeah. So that's not what the cloud providers are doing as far as I'm aware, and they're not asking for that. In fact, they're giving us hard requirements that we will expose one VF per VM, right? And so this system here works great for reality, I think, of the world. But there is nothing stopping, any cloud provider from saying, if you buy 2 disks, I'm going to show you 2 VFs. And then
it's already done there, Ben, right? We have VM types where we can get multiple VFs on the networking side and multiple disks as well. So,
but if you ever need a global QoS then enforced by the XPU across 2 or more VFs, then this system would not be able to do that. There's no way to state that these VFs are in a set for one tenant and then apply the QoS to the set.
Right.
And in fact, I would say most hardware, on the market or going to the market can't do that anyway. Like they can't make that enforcement because the enforcement is per VF, right, in the hardware. So I don't know that we need to worry about that. It is a thing someone can do. I just don't think it's a thing someone is doing.
Maybe you can achieve that with a middle end, right? You can expose the same middle end then to different VFs, and then your enforcement will be the middle end.
Well, but the middle end is per volume, though. And so the different VFs would see different volumes.
Yeah, but you can have a middle end, which is, I don't know, like you have an SPDK.
A logical volume splitter.
Split,
you're right.
Yeah.
You could do that. I don't know that it would perform great, but yes, you could do that.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't have a problem with this PR. Even if we kind of maybe find a new use cases, we can always, adjust the APIs. But I think this is a good start. Just wanted to, before we adjourn on this item, just wanted to hear from Noam and NVIDIA, if you have any thoughts on this, either online or you want to provide comments offline.
Yes, I will also look offline on what was published in the Git. But generally, I agree that this is a good idea, and I also see the need for the two-layered quality of service with volume in the volume level and the device level. This is something that we agree with.
And on device level, you agree on the controller side, right? On the VF.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. It should be done through the VF. Okay,
perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's give it a time. I would say maybe 1 week in review, if everybody is okay with that timeline. And by next meeting, if no reviews or rejections will come, we are going to merge this pull request. Agreed?
Yeah. PR is opened and comments are welcomed.
Okay, so 1 week starting today.
Okay,
thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's circle back to our first topic that we had in the list, which was unique identifier for the network interface when we talk about it in terms of being exposed to either CNIs or Kubernetes or VMs.
All right, so let me start the discussion and then everybody can jump in. So the request came from this group is to uniquely identify the virtual physical functions that are presented to the host and their according representatives inside the DPU for several reasons, whether it's, to know which VF and PF, which representative to plug into Open Virtual Switch, for example, or assigning of MAC addresses, IP addresses, and stuff like that. So there is a need that we understand to understand which VF and PF on the host side, represented by VF and PF on the DPU side. So Marvell proposed this approach during the enumeration process that happens on the host itself. The BDF is being chosen, and this BDF is being propagated over PCI Express with configuration cycles. So DPU has an opportunity to learn that BDF. Intel, I see Dan here on the call, also just suggested that a pair of VF and PF not enough for SIOV, so we need a third parameter like Q or something like that, so VF, PF, Q. So those three can be uniquely identified from the host, propagated to the DPU, and then DPU can return it. Currently, there is no standard, if I understand correctly, across the DPU vendors, how we can learn about that. I saw that comments from NVIDIA that NVIDIA does kind of naming convention on the net devices inside the DPU. What is physical function 0, 1, virtual functions, all of that. Marvell has some custom tool made that you can run and learn the BDF that is being assigned to these specific representative functions inside the DPU. And I wanted to ask Miriam and others, and Donald, you talked last week and the week before that, you talked about unique identification, maybe kind of UUID or even serial number attached. And the work group, the provisioning, asked why that's needed, and if just the BDF, I don't know, VF, PF plus Q is going to be a good enough identifier. If not, please explain why the UAD or the serial number is needed in addition to that. Make sense?
So I'm going to be honest here. I'm not sure what BDF is. Boris, can you explain what BDF is to me? I apologize.
Yeah, BDF is bus device function. This is basically the PCI
Okay.
Express address that is being enumerated and allocated on the Linux.
Okay. Yeah.
On the
So the reason why we were looking for the serial number originally was because there could be a lot of hosts in the cluster, and that was information that would allow us to uniquely identify exactly the DPU and the host it was attached to, for example. So like if it's just the bus number plus VF, SF, I'm not sure how unique that is across the cluster.
It's not unique across the cluster. The question is, if you're running some entity on the DPU, like we discussed in the network offload for CNIs, if you're running some entity on the DPU and some entity on the host, then the master controller can attach this information of I'm this host through the, and then attach the BDF, for example, information and compose that unique number for you. So basically, you only need a mapping information which DPU resides within which host, not on every single VF and PF, right? Or it's not correct understanding.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll have to talk to some of our experts on it in Red Hat who are already looking at this kind of mapping stuff. And I mean, for me, like as long as the host is uniquely identified plus the bus number, that's probably okay. Assuming that things aren't going to change and there's no hot plugging or anything like that. That sounds like we can construct a unique identifier for the VFs or SFs.
The other thinking was usage of VPD information, basically on each VF and PF, and NVIDIA on the lifecycle management call, and Noam, you can correct me, if you have a different opinion. So NVIDIA said that basically if they create a board, they can populate the VPD information because it's coming from through. But if they only provide a chip and somebody else builds a board, from our experience, the OEM or ODMs are not populating that information with anything. So it will be very hard to do the mapping using the VPD information. So if anybody has any different idea, how can we generate maybe UIDs on VFs and PFs and then expose them to both sides or the serial numbers? I'm all kind of
So are we just talking about the storage or
everything? No, networking.
Everything.
Yeah, networking. Yeah. The need came from the Kubernetes CNI offload, so we're talking about networking as well.
Well, on the networking side, maybe the MAC address or an interface, maybe, I mean, it's programmable, but
Noam, do you want to share a little bit of how NVIDIA does the naming convention? Like how do you learn which VFs and PFs or SIOV queues mapped to between the host and DPUs?
I'm not 100% know exactly how these things do. I don't deal with this on a daily basis.
Okay. All right, so we don't need to drain the time, Mark. If we can, I gave an update. We can go back to the lifecycle group and brainstorm a little bit more. And Miriam, if I understand correctly, took an action item to verify if we can get with just the BDF information, or we need something more unique.
Yeah, and I know Dan was going to put forward the concept that Intel had in mind. Okay. Great. All right, we've covered those two topics. Now, do we want to continue on with our discussions that we were having related to the Kubernetes? I know we had left off with the diagrams that Miriam shared with everyone. Did we want to continue with that?
I think maybe we wanted to try to summarize the sort of the intents from Red Hat in terms of the sort of at a high level, what the types of things that we're looking at. I think we started on that on the Nooper and I, but we'd like to try to get some time in this forum next week to go through it, to sort of come up with some high level statements around how we want the hardest problem, I think, in this Kubernetes offload is drawing the boxes, right? That whole type 1, type 2, type 3, or model 1, 2, 3, whatever that we showed earlier, and we had so much discussion around. So I think we're trying to sort of summarize the direction that Red Hat was proposing, and bring that in here. And also we wanted to run it by Red Hat first before we got it wrong. So would love to try to get some time in this forum for next week, and just gives us more time to shoot Miriam an email to you, and also finish up our slides. But I think we sort of are trying to take the presentation from the last few weeks and come up with a high level redrawing of the boxes that's aligned with the previous presentations.
Okay, I'll put that down as an agenda item for next week, Dan, if you'll be ready with that. All right. Okay, let me put back up the topics. I've added a few more notes to the topics as we were discussing things, but let me push this back up again. So we've covered the unique identifier. We covered the storage QoS. I know, Vipin, at one point you wanted to talk through there was a storage backend discussion that you wanted to have. Did you want to do that?
Yeah. I wanted to, but it looks like, Ben, myself,
Yep.
Boris, few interested people are having a discussion on how multipathing is going to unfold. So effectively, we are making progress on the side. We'll be happy
Okay.
to have a discussion here, or we could have an offline discussion and come present the views of how we need to update some bits of backend APIs. And I think Ben has put some initial ideas which I kind of like, and in line with what I was thinking.
Okay.
So we could go either way. I don't know, Ben, what's your thought? I'll let you speak for yourself.
I mean, I'm open to anything. Probably my code branches need to get put together into an actual PR that we can open.
Mhm.
I just kind of wrote down what was in my head and posted it, and there's no like testing or anything like that done yet.
Yeah, well,
So
what
I
I
think
could
we
do
should.
is maybe I could show you how I was thinking, and maybe we can reconcile the notes and you can update your PR accordingly, or we can have a discussion here and whatever works. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can do it here, or next week if we can get time, or whenever you're ready. What I wrote down is basically how SPDK and how the Linux kernel do it.
Mhm.
It's the same idea. I just
Okay.
kind of put that down into the OPI APIs, and I believe it's the way the spec was intended for it to all work. There are some like details that definitely need discussion, like where does the host NQN really belong? Is it on the path or on the controller?
Yeah.
I don't know. Some of that needs to be talked about.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm ready whenever you are. And in the meantime, we'll work on making sure this actually like compiles, and works, and get a real PR open.
Yeah, so I'm kind of ready. So whenever we can have that discussion before next week's meeting, or I can throw maybe a sample like you did in your own branch, just to show, not as a PR, but just to show what is going through my mind, and then we can have a reconciliation effort happening through the emails or Slack or whatever works in the
Okay.
OPS storage group. Right?
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
I think one thing to keep in mind, and it was kind of an open question for me, is obviously that one of the major goals is to reuse connections. Minimize the number of connections that the XPU is making to the target, and so it's not about reusing the configuration objects, though, right? Like that's not so important.
Well, I think if you reuse connections, then naturally, I mean, reuse of configuration objects becomes a side effect. I don't think I agree. That's not the goal.
It is the way I wrote it, right? Because a connection is uniquely identified by a lot of things, and all those things have to be part of the connection object or the path, what I called it.
Mhm.
And if any of that data is moved out, then they're no longer one-to-one with connections as I have them, or one-to-one with like admin queues at least.
Right.
So that was an intentional choice in my design, right? So that the configuration objects match up. The number of configuration objects you have, it tells you how many connections it makes, right? And so sort of keep that in mind as you're going through it. I did that very much on purpose.
Okay, let me scrutinize it a bit more because I glanced over it and I seem to like what you had, but at the same time, maybe we should reconcile after. Give me a day or so. I'll share my version of it and with you or with everyone in OPI storage channel, and then we can have a meeting or whatever works. I don't know. I mean, we definitely don't want to be, we want to be inclusive. So either we can have it in the OPI call next week, but then do we want to wait until then, or do we discuss the conclusion of our discussion in the OPI meeting? That's the main question mark.
Yeah,
whatever
I was gonna say, why don't you summarize it and discuss the conclusion of it and bring it up as a topic there, and then
Okay.
we can have everybody, if there's others who haven't been involved in it and have some additional comments or anything, they can feed that into it.
Sounds good. So Ben, maybe we'll have a catch-up call sometime before next week's meeting. Then I'll
Okay.
share my PR or not PR. I'll share my my changes with you, and then let's have the discussion afterwards.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. The other thing that we have still as a topic, and I'll circle with Venkat on this, he was going to work through some layering ideas that he had. So I'll circle with Venkat, find out what his view is on that and when we can get that brought back up and closed out. One of the things that I think that we need to do is go back and look at our existing diagrams and layering that we have and take into account all of the different discussions that we've had related to, what Dan was bringing up was summarizing the Kubernetes view, but we also have to look at how we summarize the other views with respect to what they should look like going forward, since we've delved into this a lot more. And then from there, we can start fleshing out some additional details, I believe. Other than that, the other things that we've been going through is really around our Kubernetes networking offload functionality. And we've been primarily talking about the primary offload. One of the discussions that came up in the TSC call today was the view of when we're going to start thinking about the details of offloading container workloads onto the DPU. I know we've been spending a lot of time looking at the CNI from the perspective of the host and the workloads being on the host, and then certain network function offloads that you're utilizing within the DPU. The next question that's come up from at least some of the TSA members is, what if they want to place an actual workload on the DPU, and then how would that tie into the network service flows or whatever other service flows that there are? That's another aspect that we need to take a look at. I have that captured in some of our pending actions and questions. Any other topics that we want to try to cover today? Because I know we've got, we want to do the summary of the Kubernetes networking infrastructure next week.
So I've drawn up a couple of diagrams around the CNI delegation just to give people an idea of the problem space.
Okay.
If people want to have a look at that for a few minutes.
Sure, that's great. Thanks, Marian.
Okay, so just let me know when you guys can see.
There we go.
Okay, cool. So in the scenario we were discussing in the last week, we were kind of looking at a 2-cluster scenario where we had a number of hosts that were DPU enabled and essentially hosts that are not DPU enabled, all residing in the same tenant cluster. And we had essentially offloaded the tenant networking to the DPU piece, which I tried to show with the red box around the open CNI, which is essentially the CNI that's also being used on the non-DPU enabled host. And that leaves us with an open question regarding, the CNI that we would like to see running on the x86 host. So at this point, I guess, I'll just recap. So essentially, the networking model we want to offload to the DPU is the OvenK networking model, and we want it to interwork with existing hosts in the clusters that are not non-DPU enabled. On the host side, all we want to do is plumb the netdev, whatever it is, a VF or a subfunction, from the host network namespace to the pod network namespace. Now, the challenge comes with Kubernetes today, in that you can only use one CNI to accomplish one level of functionality. So, like, you can use multiple CNIs in a cluster, but the CNIs have to be doing different functionalities. So one of them could be doing network policy, and the other one could be doing that plumbing that I just spoke about. But two different CNIs can't be doing the same work, which poses a problem here. If we want to use something different on these hosts versus the non-DPU enabled hosts. And I guess this is what we were talking about when I was trying to introduce CNI delegation, which is that we can go from an OR model, like CNI is doing different things, to having an AND model where CNIs could do the same thing, which would essentially enable us to run something like OvenK on our x86 hosts, and then an OPI CNI separately on the x86 hosts that are DPU enabled. Now, I did draw up a couple of different scenarios here, in that you could potentially have, Oven also running on the host side, but just modified or extended with some library functions that OPI produces to allow it to do the plumbing that it needs to do on the host side. And this wouldn't require any kind of CNI delegation, but obviously, for each time there's updates to that library, updates to Oven will have to happen. So that creates a level of dependency. Whereas if we went for a clean type of model, maybe this is an option, that library is a base part of the solution that OPI offers. And potentially you could build your own CNI that leverages that library that can operate on the host side, but this would require, a CNI delegation type support. I did find that there was a CNCF project called CNI Genie that allows you to do the CNI delegation already today. Now, I haven't investigated how to use it myself, but I guess precedent does exist to allow this kind of scenario. And I just wanted to highlight that this might be something that we may want to consider in this group when we talk about, offloading the tenant network down to the DPU. And we also need to consider the fact that, as we mentioned, as actually was mentioned just there, that we want to be able to run workloads on the infra clusters as well. So they will actually have their own CNIs potentially running down on the ARM cores alongside, the offloaded tenant networking. Does that help people kind of visualize the problem a bit better? Or
I had a comment that just to restate, I think what you said is that, are you trying to make it such that if you're doing Oven, that you want the CNI on the host to be the same CNI, whether it's offloaded or not?
So this CNI needs to be offloaded to the DPU, right? Because they have to interwork together and accomplish the exact same goals in terms of being able to connect pod to pods or services, pods to services, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So the open so the open is here on the host side. Do we want a simple CNI that just does, move VF from host namespace to pod namespace, apply IP address, apply routing information? Or do we want to get every existing CNI today to use some OPI library to accomplish that?
Yes,
That's the open. Yeah.
So
That-
you
that-
refer, no, go ahead, Dave, sorry.
I was gonna say that was something that we chewed on for a bit, like a month or two ago, and never resolved it. But I just want to second that. I think that this is like a fundamental question that we should be able to, like, if we can't answer it, at least we should be able to bubble it up to the TSC to say this is the question: is do we have to go and create a new CNI, which I don't recommend, or do we go and have to work with the Oven CNI and the Calico and the Cilium to add the cool OPI magic? I think that there are lots of people, rightfully so, saying that's going to be a lot of work. So I really think that this is just a fundamental question we have to go figure out.
Or would it be a plugin? I guess is what I was gonna add into this. Do we need to have some sort of a CNI plugin which appends onto to provide?
Yeah, so this would be kind of in this model here. So you do some
Right.
level of delegation in the existing CNI potentially to do IPAM and network plumbing or whatever, but you would provide like a base set of libraries that would enable you to do that, which actually would allow you to, if it was a base set of libraries, it would let you do this as well on
Right.
top as a flavor, So
Yeah, because I was looking at your third diagram and thinking, okay, that's to me a CNI plugin, right, in your number
Yeah.
3. And
Okay.
then the one above that is kind of I'm integrating in a library set into the CNI. And then I guess your previous one was creating a whole new CNI. Was that what number 1 was?
number
Or
1
this-
is just the question mark. What
Oh,
are we
yeah.
doing?
Yeah, what are we doing? Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And also just a reminder that, because we are running workloads down here, there is something running down here as well in terms of a CNI on the ARM cores potentially.
Right, and that would need to be
Yeah.
a CNI or a CNI with a plugin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Maybe just an idea. Maybe a new CNI, it will be a better idea because if you try to actually incorporate all the different characteristics of an IPU that you have in existing CNIs, maybe you will make the existing CNIs too complicated. Maybe at some point, a new CNI, it will be better than incorporating the changes to an existing CNI, because we are talking about an XPU which can come from different vendors and can expose different characteristics. So maybe it's better to use a new CNI for that. I don't know, just an idea.
So
Yeah.
OPI API could be the abstraction that will not add some complexity on the CNI. Just I wanted to raise one point. Mariam, about this thing of delegation, because it's this key question of CNI, new CNI, I think are the key topics, but saying that we should also add new concept of delegation or use new project in Kubernetes perhaps is a risk, or trying to keep focus on the big things, on the perhaps I know this thing was a question asking, can we have some host without DPU, or perhaps for the first iteration to say let's keep it simple and say that every host has a DPU and we are not adding complexity. Perhaps I don't know if it's it simplifies the problem by saying that we could have some hosts without DPUs?
No, I mean, if there's no heterogeneity, I guess, in the tenant cluster, the problem is simplified, because essentially you can run pretty much whatever you want on this side, as long as you're offloading the previous tenant networking infrastructure that you wanted onto the DPU. It doesn't really matter as much, you know.
Yeah, but still, we have still the questions of new CNI, not new CNI, all these things.
Yeah, I think I'll just make one comment, which is that new CNI would definitely be easier on the DPU vendors, and can get to maybe POC pretty quick. Plugins comment that you made, Mark, I don't know whether all existing CNIs today have some kind of plugin infrastructure, and to that,
Yeah, no, they don't.
Yeah, they don't. And in fact, I know they don't, which is why I think I was asking for Oven. Were you suggesting that you will create something like that, or were you saying we will have to have something which could then start to offload?
So I'm just using Oven as an example here. I could have put Calico on these boxes.
Let's use
else.
Oven because for Oven, I mean, yeah, sure, Oven can run on a standard host just fine without any problems and all. But were you suggesting that we will end up creating an API to offload things for Oven to be different from that of Calico, to be different from that of Cilium?
No, that's not what I'm suggesting at all.
Okay.
All I was saying was, if this was previously a tenant cluster that was full of Oven Kubernetes CNIs, now when I have the DPUs, I've offloaded the Oven portion onto my DPU using our high-level APIs, I hope, or that are high-level enough abstraction. Doesn't matter if it's Oven or Calico or whatever. The open is on the host side in terms of the DPU-enabled hosts CNI. So what do we use? Do we still use Oven, but just modify it so that it caters for
it doesn't,
VF and SF?
I don't know if it makes sense to use Oven there, because technically all you need is a glue to attach VF to something, and that could be, you don't need to overload that with Oven here at all. In fact, everyone would probably agree that reusing that in a different mode, just trying to do like 1% or 2% of the function, is not worth adjusting the existing CNIs for, if all you need is just a hook that drops into the DPU for a given pod. But
yeah,
I think
and that was the point I was trying to make before, which is it's
I think
difficult.
that is a little bit non-controversial in the sense that, it makes a lot of sense to just create something simpler to go that route. I think the main controversial question, which I think Boris also asked last meeting, is that, are we shifting the problem of what needs to be offloaded from x86 now to DPU? Now, how do you homogenize from DPU various CNIs that are running on the DPU to start taking advantage of DPU there? Can we do it in a uniform way? So that is the main problem to solve.
Yeah, when you say, I second that. When you say that now Oven running inside the DPU, this Oven need to change in order to accommodate for the OPI APIs. And if it's not Oven, if it's Calico, then Calico needs to change. If it's Cilium, then Cilium needs to change. So we just shifted the same problem of needing to change the existing CNIs to incorporate OPI APIs.
Correct.
That are running inside the DPUs. Doesn't really matter what we're running on the host.
Correct.
The problem's still the same.
Yeah, I think that while you're running the entire CNI on DPU, what goes on host is a simpler problem to address, in my opinion. I think the bigger elephant in the room is the second one.
Yeah, I completely agree. The second one is harder to tackle compared to the small version of node agent or whatever that runs on the host.
Correct.
Erwin, I think you have your hand raised.
So we started with the prototyping with Calico for the same reasons, because Calico already supported a plugin model for the data plane. So it was easier for us to fast prototype for DPU offload, complete DPU offload. And because of this plugin model, we can pull in standard APIs, use the standard APIs, and still in the back, change it with our vendor specific APIs for offloading. So if plugin model is what people are thinking makes more sense, then most of the APIs have their code organized in such a way that when it comes to data path, it's in a separate library form. And if that
So I'm not sure about talking about a plugin model when we talk about offloading the tenant networking to the DPU, because it's not actually going to look like a CNI down here. That I guess I presumed that whatever networking functionality was originally happening here, and we're able to describe it at a relatively high level, we'll be able to describe it to the OPI APIs via CRDs or whatever. That gets programmed onto our accelerator to reflect the same level of functionality that was previously provided by the tenant networking infrastructure, right? So having a plugin model for the CNI here, it doesn't matter, because that CNI is servicing the infrastructure cluster. It's not servicing the tenant cluster at all. So my networking has been fully offloaded onto this DPU accelerator with a fallback that's the kernel. Now doesn't look like a CNI anymore. You know, it may accomplish the functionalities that the CNI did before, but it doesn't look like a CNI at all. Or am I misunderstanding what the goal and the intent is?
So let me break this problem into 3 parts, right? First is like whatever CNI traditionally was running on a host, now we are thinking of moving it to DPU, right? So that's problem statement number 1, that the existing CNIs are not going to run on DPU. So for them to do an offload of tenant networking flows, the proper CNI is now running on DPU. Second is the interface addition to the containers, right? That happens on the host, which is a node agent or something very light, which maybe can be written from scratch for DPU cases, like just adding the interfaces to containers. That kind of CNI that runs on host. Now, Mariam, this is where there's a small disconnect, and I would like to understand that. For the CNI that is running on DPU as of today, it's already talking to Kubernetes API server. Is it true or not? This is the disconnect I have. It's already receiving most of the information through watching the objects on API server. Right.
So this is why we were using an XPU controller rather than the CNI on the DPU, because the CNI on the DPU has to be able to run the infra cluster workloads. You know, if you want to run a daemon set on your DPU to do something like potentially, you know, a daemon set that has like an OPI API front end in it, and then your actual vendor API as a backend in it, that has to run as, I presume, a container on the DPU itself.
That is true, right? So that particular CNI that's running on the DPU is listening for all the object information, and it has the information to offload on DPU then, right?
I'm not using the CNI on the DPU. The CNI on the DPU is for infra workload. I'm not using it for tenant workload at all. And that's why I was using this XPU controller to listen to the Kube API server on the tenant side. So he's listening to pod resources. He's listening to network policy. He's listening to, we were going to create 1 or 2 new custom resources around the actual NetDev which is what all those sequence diagrams were about in the previous meetings.
Right.
Because I
So-
don't think we can reuse the CNI here to listen to what's going on here. It's no longer a CNI at that point. It's something else.
Right. So whatever, like the XPU controller that's running here is implementing whatever the Kubernetes client functionality to offload to DPU.
Yes.
Right. That is
Yes.
That is understood. And for running the containers on the DPU, you're talking about running a separate CNI.
Which what you would have to do anyways for standard Kubernetes deployment, right?
Right, right. Right, that is true.
But
And
if
for-
you don't have CNI anymore, because let's say we go with route number 1, we create OPI CNI just to do very basic functionality, and we don't have any CNI inside the DPU, don't we lose the functionality and the choice of the customer that chose the specific CNI for specific reasons? And we basically don't have any CNI for tenant cluster anymore. Whether it's Cilium, Calico, or whatever OVN they chose for any kind of reason.
I think we are losing audience. It will be good. I'm super excited to have this discussion. It will be good to have interested people have an offline discussion on this very topic, on how we could get this this aspect of it sorted out.
Yeah, there's actually a project Kubernetes channel that we could start having that discussion in.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on Zoom call as well, just so that we can try and close this, because I think this is probably third week we are bringing back the same question. And we may have to make some tough calls, but at least we need to move forward, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm hoping to answer the simpler questions first, you see, so we can tick them off the list and then we can tackle the harder ones.
I agree with Miriam. Let's break it up into smaller items and then let's figure it out. If we all kind of can agree on the OPI, CNI, and U1, let's weigh pros and cons and decide on that if that's easier, and then go from there.
Yep. Let's do that. Okay. Well, we're over time, but it was a good meeting. Thanks, everyone. We'll pick up again next week, and let's start figuring out how to have some of these discussions in offline meetings. We can set up one-offs.
Yeah, if people want to have Zoom meetings before next week's meeting, I'm up for it. Just let's call it out.
Right.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.